Today, we're going to be talking about flick control. I like to use large, real-life diagrams to help teach these ideas since I think it's easier for people to learn with big movements before moving to small ones. If you'd like to follow along yourself and are a hands-on learner, try replicating this dot layout on a blank piece of paper using a pen. Flicks normally have four components. The first component is called the initial. This is a large movement designed to close the gap to the next target. The second step is a small micro adjustment. This is designed to use precision to fix any errors generated by the initial and take us fully to the target in one clean movement. The third step is the preparation. This is where we confirm our shot looks good and we visually identify our next target and prepare the tension in our hand and arm necessary to fuel the upcoming flick. The fourth step is to shoot and immediately move. Do not perform this step until you have fully prepared your next flick. The muscles in your arm don't like staying tense for too long, so try to think about this similar to breathing. In and out. Tense and relax. Prepare and flick. In and out. Tense and relax. Prepare and flick. Here's an example of wide wall 4 targets small. Notice the clear initial and micro adjustment present on each one of these flicks. However, it's important to understand that the confirmation and preparation are still occurring, even if you can't see them. Let's talk about a notable exception to full-sized flicks. What about these densely packed targets here? Here, we want to utilize cluster farming, or chaining, where we perform several micro adjustments in a short period of time on multiple targets. Your ability to chain largely depends on your experience and your skill, so don't be surprised if this range is pretty small when you first start. Densely packed targets like this are nice for going fast because we can many times skip the micro correction entirely. However, this takes away from time normally used for our confirmation and preparation, so it is important that we replace this by thinking ahead multiple targets in advance with an idea known as pathing. Let's take some of these ideas and apply them to some dots that might look a little bit more like what we would see in-game. Here's a small collection of tiny dots at a distance that probably is more reflective of what we are actually doing with our mouse. Pretty small, right? Initials, micros, and preparations all still occur, even for small distances such as these. Notice how the fingers, the wrist, and the arm all work together in an idea known as blending to slice up this space and path efficiently through these targets. Here's an in-game example of what these movements might look like. Notice how the fingers primarily assist with vertical motions and the wrist helps be snappy for horizontal ones. Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about the range of motion that each part of our hand and arm have and how they can work together to accomplish various tasks in clicking. Let's start with the finger range of motion. This is a small circle that is meant to represent our finger range of motion. By using the middle fingers, we can go up and down, and by using the thumb and the pinky, we can move left and right. Work them together, and you can generate small, controlled circles that allow us a great deal of control within this range. This is generally our micro range. Here's an in-game example that shows what these flicks might look like on your screen. Keep in mind that just because these flicks are small doesn't mean they shouldn't be mentally processed the same way as your big ones. For longer flicks, you might see a large initial movement and then our micro be utilized to close the gap with a precise adjustment. Big, small, big, small, big, small. And this scales even as our pace increases. It's important for us to also think about transitioning in and out of the cluster state. For example, with these small 4 inner targets, I might be able to utilize my immediate micro and wrist range to secure these targets. But for the larger targets, I might transition to a more traditional initial and micro adjustment style. Most static clicking scenarios utilize quite a bit of randomness for spawns. Make sure that part of your preparation includes planning on whether you intend on chaining a target or utilizing more traditional 2-stage technique to navigate throughout the map. Here's an in-game example of more randomized target spawns. Notice how with my longer flicks, I add a careful micro adjustment to ensure my shot is on target, but I speed my pace up with clustered farming when possible. Next, let's talk about generating large motions using the arm and blending those large movements into our small ones with the fingers and wrist. First, use the arm to move the mouse up and down. Then, start incorporating your fingers to move the mouse up and down at the edges of these motions. We go down, the fingers go down. The arms go up, the fingers go up. By blending these two things together, you make it so that neither component has to work too hard, which helps take the edge off of high bursts of tension and lets you stay in control even during large motions. Here's an in-game example of me using my arms and my fingers together in order to create efficient, full-length movements that help me prevent over-tensing and using too much tension from any one individual movement. We can do the same thing with the x-axis. By using the arm to help us cross some of the distance, we can take the edge off of some of the tension required to generate wrist flicks and make our movements very sustainable even for extended periods of time across larger distances. Notice here how my wrist and arm work together so that neither component has to work too hard to cross these large distances. While we are doing this, it's important that we don't put the wrist under too much tension, especially when we arrive at our destination. Instead of having very tense movements with the wrist where we lock ourselves out and stay high tension all the time, use a little bit of tension to make the wrist adjustment happen and then glide the remainder of the way. This is far more efficient and allows us to sustain ourselves during extended movements. Here's an in-game example of me using the wrist and the arm together to generate large, full-range, horizontal movements without dipping too far into my tension reserves.
First red light I've ever seen.
Come on, Peach.
Oh.
Now what?
This was a lot of information. Let's briefly recap some of it so that when we head back to the aim trainer, we're in a good position to start practicing effectively. Flicks have 4 components: the initial, the micro, preparation, and shooting and moving. Chaining or cluster farming. Directly flick to targets, ensuring to visualize multiple targets ahead of you. There's 3 kinds of flicks: long flicks, small flicks, and micro flicks. Choosing the right tool for the job before your flick starts will help you score effectively on target fields with random spawns. It's important that we manage tension in our runs by immediately relaxing our flick tension as soon as we've utilized it to generate speed. Additionally, we want to make sure that we are using the arm, wrist, and fingers to blend large movements together so that no one single movement generates a high enough amount of tension to place us into a state of tension lockout. Additionally, it should go without saying, but static targets don't move, so your accuracy should be very high, 95% or higher. If you're new, 60 centimeters per revolution is an effective sensitivity to start experimenting with, although you may try finding faster or slower sensitivities desirable to assist with your training. It's common to spend lots of time static clicking and not getting anything out of it, so I'm going to briefly talk about common beginner errors as well as give you some cues to help you train effectively on your own. Here's an example of my preferred way to warm up for static clicking. Notice that I have added an extra large pause after I have arrived at the target, but before I shoot and move. This pause is generous on purpose. I'm using it to warm up my confirmations and preparations since so much of this involves hand-eye coordination and visual processing. My intent is very simple. Start each static session by warming up in this method with a generous pause placed in between your shots. Then, once you are ready or feel your flow state, proceed to reduce or remove this pause and increase your pace. I cannot emphasize enough how strongly I believe that preparations are vital to warming up and training flicks correctly. Over time, I've adopted a simple mantra to live by. You can't out-micro bad flicks. Let's troubleshoot some common issues that prevent people from training static clicking correctly. Training cue 1. One shot attempt per target. Do not multi-click, spam, double tap, or double back on missed shots when training static clicking. Training cue 2. Don't shoot until you have fully prepared the tension for your next flick. Common signs of inadequate flick preparation include curved flicks or sluggishly moving between targets. Your accuracy will also likely be poor. Training cue 3. Shoot, then immediately move. Hesitation or looking behind to see whether your shot connected will never lead to a good pace. Always be thinking about the target in front of you, not behind. Here's a few other unordered things that can cause you to score poorly in your runs. Not flicking. Not preparing flicks. Over flicking. Make sure that you are not using your initial to flick past targets. This wastes tension and will quickly lead to tension lockout. Clicking to an internal metronome. Please make sure that your pace naturally goes up and down as you get opportunities to enter and exit chaining phases. That being said, if your technique looks like this when you are a beginner, there is nothing wrong with that because there are purposeful flicks, controlled micros, and each target gets all 4 flick components, which makes for good practice. One thing I haven't talked about much yet is reflex flicks. These kinds of flicks are very common in tactical shooters such as Valorant and Counter-Strike. These flicks are unique. They require a little bit more pre-tension than other types of flicks because we want to generate a somewhat locked down, unidirectional zone of control that our reflexive system can tap into quickly and accurately. Even though reflex flicks are just a small portion overall of flick control, I think it's important to address for 2 reasons. 1, it's extremely relevant in titles such as tactical FPS, and 2, I think it lays an effective groundwork for what will come later for advanced aim trainers for fluidity. To be clear, I think reflex flicks are worth training for their own sake, even for beginners. Long term, who knows? You might be surprised at how their unique approach to tension curves apply to your static runs. Let's talk about how reflex flicks feel compared to most other flicks. These flicks need to be a natural extension of our hand. Otherwise, our reflexive system won't be able to properly benefit from it. This means that we should try to incorporate natural extensions of the wrist and fingers. The fingers extend to go up, the fingers contract to go down. The wrist goes left and right for horizontal movements. Combining these allows us to generate our small range of controlled movements. Flexing these muscles in such a manner when we put the mouse in our hand will result in our reflexive zone of control. Let's take this to in-game and with a mouse in our hand. Using this example scenario, I am demonstrating how this sort of finger extension and contraction is being utilized to tap into my intuitive understanding of how to reach for things using my hand. It's almost like I'm really reaching out and touching the dot with my fingers, if that makes sense. Once you build a more intuitive understanding about how your natural skill at reaching for things with your fingers can be utilized by your brain to achieve flicks within this range, we can start immersing ourselves in the actual reflexive component. Scenarios such as Reflex Flicks Easy, Fair, and Hard provide great opportunities for players to assess their ability to reflexively utilize this range of motion. I encourage players to not only push themselves on the more challenging difficulties, but to also try to score 100% accuracy on the easier variants as a way to practice consistency. I'd like to say thank you in particular to Slendro for their help and expertise when it comes to reflex flicking mechanics. Hopefully, this information helps motivate some of you to explore this interesting style of flicking. The last thing I'd like to leave in this video is one unedited run of one wall, 6 targets small. Feel free to use this footage as a reference for pathing and arm blending ideas.